Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Today we are going to talk about Hiroshima and we're going to continue our story. But before we do, we're going to introduce a new segment into the show for today, which is basically the administration section. Like all good organizations and cults, Kieran, we have to get our housekeeping out of the way first. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for everybody who has sent me feedback about the podcast. I really appreciate it. I've been getting some great messages about the content, about some of the things we've been discussing. And it's I really do appreciate the feedback. And I know so does Kieran. And I'm glad that we're helping some people in terms of asking themselves some questions. And I know some people have had some existential angst as well. Some people have gone, maybe I can't listen to this for a few more weeks because I'm getting a bit fucking stressed out listening to this. And that's fine too. Listen to it when you're ready. Just looking at some of the metrics the other day as well, it was interesting that Colin Rhodes near-death experiences are most downloaded podcast, which is great. But please check out the other episodes if you haven't heard them as well, because there's some good nuggets in those. The other thing as well is if you are enjoying the episodes, you can jump on there to one of those podcast apps like Apple, give us a rating if you wish. But more importantly, share it with your friends. The website's up there; it's getting updated regularly, and there's lots of good stuff on there in terms of the episodes that you can share around on YouTube or the podcast episodes. So please share those around. The other thing is some people have asked me about references and books. I know a number of people listening to the show have developed a reading list. I met with a guy the other day about another project, and he said he ended up listening to one episode, Karen, and then he ended up listening to them all. And he's actually made a reading list of books he has to buy. So,
no way.
I've got about 10 books now I need to buy after listening to you guys, which is great. But what I would say is, guys, please go down to the show notes, because we do reference most of those books in the show notes. The references are there and the links are there as well. But more importantly, on the website, there is a recommended reading list, right? And I will be getting updated every sort of maybe quarter or 6 months. And I have put the links in there where you can download free copies of the book. Not in a bad way. You're not going to get in trouble. A lot of these older books are freely available and they're under sort of, common law distribution, or whatever that fucking things are called. You can download them for free. So if you want to read them on an iPad or online, you can do that as well. So please go over there and check those out. Lots of free downloads there that you can download and read on an iPad or whatever you want to do. Or obviously you can go and buy them in print if that's your preference. My preference is always print. I just like the tactile feel of a book. But there's stuff over there. But so please go and check out the show notes. Share it with your friends, more importantly, and if you like it, then give us a review, and we'll keep these episodes 100% free as always. And if you'd like any merchandise to be developed, let us know, because that would be a great way to support some of the underlying podcast costs. We're not looking to make money of it, but if we could cover some of the costs, it'd be great for editing and hosting and so on. A couple of t-shirt ideas we had was just the Learning to Die podcast logo. One I had was Namaste, Sapiens, might be a good one, Karen, as a t-shirt.
Class.
So if anybody's got any ideas or you'd like some merchandise, let us know and we'll see if we can get some stuff made. So with that, we'll crack into part 2 of Hiroshima. So
what episode was part 1? Was that episode 8? I think wasn't it? 7, 8. Or
that 9? Was episode 8. Yeah. So so we're going to continue on from episode 8. The first
and this
part
will be a kind of somewhat of a standalone episode as well, I think, given the focus that we're going to have. People could listen to this one first and then go back and listen to the other one, because what I wanted to touch on here was I've got some writing here that I've done that I haven't published anywhere yet, and I can just read these stories around some nuclear near misses. And
now, Kieran, before you read out this great essay, this is 16 pages long. I've read this. Are you going to make this is the Manhattan Project?
But this is actually a separate thing again. This is a different essay.
Another essay. You're a fucking essay machine. Are you actually ever going to put some of these up as reading on the website? Are you actually going to give some of this content to the listeners who are starving out there to listen to your great words on paper or read them on paper?
I'll see what way to break them up and to publish them and what way to do it. I spent so much time because all the in-person coaching stuff was on the back burner during the lockdown, and I was only able to do stuff online, and I had much more time at home, obviously, because you had a 5K limit on travel and everything. I basically spent a lot of time writing and researching these areas, and there was no better way for me to learn about this stuff than to try and write about it.
Yeah.
So when I got interested, there were things that I wanted to write about, and I've been working on a what might very well be a book project or a book, but regardless, the actual writing itself has gone all over the place. Surprise, surprise, in terms of directions. And some of these directions involved looking into nuclear war and nuclear weaponry, and the nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapon development, nuclear near misses. These areas that are the more I went down the rabbit hole, the more I was like, we're lucky to be around. Like, lucky. Like, wait till you hear some of this shit, like, and how close this stuff.
All right. Well, I won't press you to make this stuff available as of yet. I'll leave that to you to maybe decide. And maybe people can email you and annoy you to write a book for them. So with that, I'll let you go.
Will publish some of them. Like I'm breaking them up into chunks now and figuring out what stuff is worth publishing as separate essays and what stuff is worth keeping around, or maybe publishing it as audio podcasts as well. Or audio essays as a podcast. Like just reading out sections of them. So because I think if it's of interest to people and because I actually really enjoy the writing process and stitching together arguments and figuring out narratives and what way this stuff fits together. I really enjoy the whole writing thing as a creative act.
Yeah.
It's almost like the kind of fitting puzzle pieces together. I really enjoy it. So, we might see. We'll see what way they end up being published. But
just on that, we
can talk about it on the podcast.
Just on the creative side, you know what I started doing the last 3 weeks? Drawing mandalas. So slightly inspired by Carl Jung, but also I've always been drawn to Tibetan art in terms of looking at mandalas and things. So I've been using it as an exercise. And my wife said to me the other night, because I went down to the shop and I got this watercolor sketcher pad thing, whatever you call it. So it wouldn't go through the paper. It's quite hard. And look, I'm shit at drawing. Like, I'm not going to make out some sort of artist here creating some stuff, but I just thought I'm going to give this a crack, and I watched some little videos on YouTube, and I just got creative with stuff and bought a compass and started doing some stuff. And my wife said to me the other night, sitting on the couch, and I was just sitting there drawing away. She goes, "That's the quietest I've ever seen you in 20 fucking years." And I went, "What?" She goes, "You haven't opened your mouth in an hour." I was like, "Oh, it's actually quite meditative." Meditative, yeah. So if she's sitting there on the couch, like watching, I don't know, the Australian Bake Off or the British Bake Off or something, I'll just be sitting there. I get the pad out, got my pencils, a couple of markers, and I just do it. And I just sit there, and it's actually quite relaxing. And and on the days I've been really stressed, I've been doing it. Like if I've been really busy, I've been doing it in the evening. It's actually quite nice. Like, don't get me wrong, man, absolutely shit at them, and have no focus or no direction. Just sit down and go, what kind of shape I like to draw, and start drawing it. And it's really nice to go just creative and wide and see what comes out with no purpose.
That creative process, when you're in it, it's it's such a beautiful place to be when you're absorbed and you're just absorbed in this creative process, making sense of something, whether it be with a pen. But for me, it's writing. For someone else, it might be holding a guitar in their hand, making sense of the world of music, and this idea, it's the creative process is, I don't know if it's something that you could say everyone or even most people might enjoy, but I don't know how many people are actually aware of how rewarding for its own sake, not orientated at a particular outcome, not orientated toward getting a project done or getting something finished, but just being in something that ends up, it's almost like a form of creative play. Like, it's rewarding for its own sake, regardless of the outside world. It's that's what I get out of martial arts. That's exactly what I get out of jiu-jitsu.
I don't really care about the belts anymore. I just care about the play. It's rewarding for the sake of doing it.
Yeah.
I don't get caught up in the whole crazy aggressive, like being a tough guy thing. I just really don't. It's just play. It's being in the moment. It's a physical art. It's like doing capoeira or gymnastics nearly for me. And then this part here is just another part of exploring it. Obviously, I do a lot of writing scientifically and in business. So I feel like I don't want to write a lot then when I don't have to, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But I have tried to do some writing in that more creative space. And I think I will move more towards that. And I think maybe it'll be probably when I get in a sort of a semi-retirement type of phase, because I'll never retire. But when I don't have to spend most of the day sitting at a laptop, doing analysis or writing reports for clients or doing that type of work, it's like being a professional musician. You're playing guitar all day, in a shopping center. You're not going to go home then and want to riff on your guitar for 2 hours. It's just a bit, I need something kind of different.
Yeah.
So
that's why Musashi, but that's the deal with Musashi, where he had he himself was, I think one of the Musashi episodes we recorded, at least we talked about him being an artist and a calligrapher and a poet.
That's right. The pottery.
Drawing pictures of birds and nature and drawing pictures of the Japanese wildlife, as well as doing his calligraphy and poetry based stuff, and as well as killing 62 people. And I
was going to say, can you imagine Musashi? Oh, it's a beautiful day. He's drawing a picture of a bird and a bonsai tree and a cherry blossom. Oh shit, it's 1:00. I gotta go and kill a motherfucker. I'll be back in a minute. Yeah. Hold that for me. Yeah. Comes back at 2, covered in blood. Brush. Yeah, hold that brush. I'm going to go off and fucking club some lad to death.
Yeah. With an oar. I'm
with an oar,
with an oar. Hold my paintbrush.
Yeah. And then he comes back and gets his paintbrush. Hey, Musashi, when's your 15th birthday? You've been fighting since you're 13.
Yeah. That's that. But that's the thing. It's like that way, that feeling of being in that absorbed state is the same regardless of the craft, whether it be someone surfing or climbing. For me, it was like it could be, I could be climbing, I could be rolling in jiu-jitsu, I could be doing some bag work, going for runs in woods, writing. But it's like, but certain crafts at certain times zone you in more depending on what else is going on in your life,
pint.
Yeah. Maybe that can happen, definitely, like maybe at gigs. But let's talk about nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, I was going to say we're off in tangents again. Let's go on to the nuclear holocaust. Let's go on to something a bit better.
Yeah, let's talk about something cheery and how often we've basically avoided the apocalypse. So what I was thinking we could do is basically, I'll just read it like the first paragraph, because I think the first paragraph gives us kind of a summary of where we're at, and it touches on a few of the points from the previous episode. We did episode 8, and then I've got these 2 stories that I can read out. One is about a guy called Vasili Arkhipov, and the other one is about a fella called Stanislav Petrov. And then I can read one at a time, and we can have a chat about them. Basically, how's that sound? Good. So
that sounds great. I was just muting myself there because of the blow me nose. I just was in the swimming pool today, and I didn't want chlorine dripping into the microphone there and blowing out the eardrums of people. I don't have COVID. Relax.
So, in 1945, humanity crossed over into a new era of civilization. We did this when we developed the ability to end the march of mankind through militaristically harnessing the power of the atom. Toby Ord, a colleague of the aforementioned Bostrom at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, has, in his book of the same name, called this era the precipice. Due to an arms race against Axis powers and the subsequent development of the bomb, we have stepped into a time in which we have the ability to destroy all of humanity and most of life on Earth without the commensurate wisdom to ensure we do not do so. The 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were atomic bombs, A-bombs, nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man, respectively. These 2 A-bombs alone killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese people on August 6th and 9th, 1945. Unfortunately, since 1952 and the invention of hydrogen bombs, H-bombs, thousands of nuclear weapons exist on Earth, with each one having orders of magnitude more destructive power than the A-bombs. In fact, a single thermonuclear H-bomb could have more explosive power than every single explosive device used by all sides in World War II, including the 2 A-bombs dropped on Japan, combined. Let that sink in. I do find it quite worrying that we have the planet-destroying capacity of mythological deities, along with the all too evident irrational tribal tendencies of caffeinated chimpanzees. While we have managed thus far to avoid destroying ourselves, the 76 years since the bomb ushered us into an era of extinction-level destructive capacity is but a blink of an eye in terms of the 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence. Given that a mammalian species on Earth has had an average lifespan from origin to extinction of about 1 million years, we look to be doing a good job of ensuring we cut ourselves short of at least 700,000 years of potential experience. I say at least, because humanity's scientific and engineering capabilities leave me hopeful that if we can avoid destroying ourselves, we could live much longer than the average mammal as a species. However, my pessimism at our chances of survival in the current state of affairs, in which people seem to care more about the names of celebrity babies than the survival of our species, is because we have, in the last 7 decades, come too close on too many occasions for us to relax our guard into anything even approximating complacency. And barely anyone seems to recognize this fact. 2 such close encounters with the apocalypse involve Russian men to whose actions we likely owe our very lives, but whom most of us could not name. That's the kind of introduction paragraph to this section. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about, like, you would have thought, like, after World War II, that basically we would have looked at what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like we spoke about in the last podcast, because researching that last episode to me was quite confronting. And I sat there and I looked at it and I was like, you see the images, you see what happened, you take into context the end of World War II, people starving, the way Japan was, and just that whole situation, really. You look at it and my heart like sinks for people at that time, innocent civilians walking around that just basically got decimated. And you think, like, surely as a species, we would have looked at that and went, whoa, that was a bit full on. That was a bit crazy. You look how the world reacted to 9/11. And I'm not lessening what happened on 9/11, but 3,000 people were killed there, and that changed the world forever. And you kind of think of it in that respect. And then we had that happen in 1945. And you think, fucking hell, how do we not go, this is just not allowed. This is just not permissible after this. The more I look at that Hiroshima thing, Nagasaki, the more I think, how do we allow that to continue? Like, if you just go in and Google Hiroshima afterwards, it's absolutely bonkers. And that's the first thing that comes to mind, how we allowed ourselves to progress past that again. And how we still have it today in our world. And like what you're saying, that whole Cold War era, like in the 80s, probably even before, like I was born in the late 70s, and in the 80s, all like World War III is going to happen. There was a great movie called Red Dawn. They did a remake of it a few years ago. Patrick Swayze was in it, Charlie Sheen, I think Emilio Estevez. It was basically the Russians were going to land in America. Like, it was that whole kind of, the communists are coming. And that was all this going to be Cold War, nuclear war. There was a movie called War Games with Matthew Broderick. I think it was in 1984. I don't know if you've ever seen that as well, where it's pretty corny, pretty stupid, but it's worth watching because it just gives you a feel of what the world was like at the time.
I saw the remake of Red Dawn from based in Australia with the Chinese landing.
Well, it was, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. There was something happened there. Didn't they change that after the fact? It was
your man Thor was the
Chris Hemsworth. Yeah,
Chris Hemsworth was in it, and it was the Chinese landed on Australia.
No, I think it was changed from the Chinese to the North Koreans.
Oh yeah, there were some technologically advanced North Koreans. I don't know if North Korea have that.
I think it was changed post production because it wouldn't have got up in the Chinese community, and maybe some of the owners might have been partly to play there as well, because I think a lot of Chinese government might have their hand up the ass of Disney and other companies like that. So, because I know the other one, Doctor Strange, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
So the monk in that, the lady that plays the monk, Tilda something, Anyway, that originally was supposed to be a Tibetan monk dressed in like the red robes, and they had to change it afterwards and put her in because the Chinese were like, no, we don't recognize Tibet as a country, and you can't put this in.
So want to make a Tibetan look good. They didn't want a Tibetan person looking good because it went so against the Chinese propaganda.
Yeah, and Tibet like is considered to be a province of China, not a country of its own. That's a whole different story as well that we could look into another day. The Dalai Lama and the escape from Tibet. That's a fascinating story if anybody wants to look at that, because not to digress too much, but you kind of look at that and you go, the Dalai Lama is so well known and Tibetan Buddhism is so well known, but they were hidden away from the world for thousands of years. And it's this kind of classic thing of like the positive drives the negative, or the negative might drive the positive. The Chinese came in, invaded it in the 50s. The Tibetans had to leave. And because of that, nearly every person in the world knows the Dalai Lama. More people probably know the Dalai Lama than the Pope. So in some ways, it actually helped the explosion of Buddhism across the world and the explosion of the Tibetan culture. But with that comes the loss of their land, the destruction of temples, there's great stories about POWs in Tibetan culture that were in POW camps for 3, 4, 5 more years, starving to death. Anyway, I'm digressing again. But anyway, I think what my comment really on your passage was the fact that we allow this to continue is beyond me. That's beyond me. And then obviously we spoke about, and I put it in the link for the last episode, Oppenheimer's words about, I have become, destroyer of worlds from the Bhagavad Gita. Like, what's wrong with us, Kieran? Why can't we? Like, what do you think's wrong with us as a species? Why are we so hell bent on blowing ourselves up?
I've obviously, and as from all our discussions and Becker and everything, it's narratives, it's the fictional stories we tell ourselves about how special we are and how meaningful the cultural worldview. It's like we have these tendencies towards outgroup dehumanization and that are driven by fear. And we have this, where as a human, we're in an existentially bizarre situation, as what Becker called a god with an anus, where we have this biological drive to survive bouncing off a top-down awareness of time and mortality. And then we resolve that conflict by essentially coming up with stories that allow ourselves to convince ourselves we are a meaningful part, and we are a valuable part of a world that is meaningful. And part of that is the stories we tell ourselves about how special our society is, or how special we are relative to them, ethnic supremacy, religious supremacy, inferiorities, superiorities relative to other baldy apes that are also just fumbling around trying to figure shit out. And then this religion is better than that one, or this nation is better than this flag, whatever, this ethnicity, this bloodline, there's all this silly shit. And part of that is that we just have these innate tribal tendencies that go along with this stuff. And I think with regards to the nuclear era, the bizarre thing about the situation as well is that the weaponry can't even be used, because the rhetoric during the Cold War was that if I attack you, I'm less likely to do it because I'm afraid you'll attack me back and we all die. But the thing is, if I attack you, we all die anyway. Because it used to be called mutually assured destruction. Thank the acronym MAD, M-A-D, because it was thought, well, if Russia attacked the US and the vice versa, then everyone dies. But the reality is actually self-assured destruction. That if Russia attack America or America attack Russia, everyone still dies, because we all starve to death, because the world is plunged into a new ice age from firestorms putting particulate matter into the upper atmosphere and reflecting out the sun in a nuclear winter scenario. And that modeling is only available in a basic level since the early 1980s, 1983, 84, due to work like what we talked about in the previous episode with like Alan Toon and Alan Roebuck and Owen Toon and Carl Sagan were involved in that. And now the most recent modeling has shown that even a localized conflict between India and Pakistan could result. And they only have about 150 weapons each. And a localized conflict there just in India and Pakistan that could kick off and escalate over something like Kashmir. Then all of a sudden, then we all still starve to death pretty much, except for some people who were able to do a bit of fishing and grow spuds off the coast of New Zealand. Basically, that's who gets left behind.
So Bill Gates, because he's buying up land down there.
Yeah, I actually have a book up there called Notes from an Apocalypse, and there's a section in it about there's a whole bit in it about billionaire preppers basically buying up land in New Zealand. But yeah,
speaking of the Indian Kashmir border, have you seen this, Karen, of the Indian Pakistan border? Have you seen the border ceremony change that happens every evening? Have you seen this?
Yeah. Jesus, man. Yeah.
I might just put
just
it on, but it's interesting because these guys were actually the same country, you know, up until what, the 40s or that. And then they come up.
Yeah, and they actually have peacock hats on.
Yeah, it's like that's probably a good thing to see. Yeah, because they have these peacock things on. And now we're in front of one another, blowing horns at one another and saluting, and flags going up and flags going down. I wouldn't mind actually going to watch it. You know, it is.
Yeah, my buddy Timmy's going to see it. Yeah, my buddy Timmy's going to see that. It was so strange just to see the video he sent. But yeah, like that kind of behavior. At least it's happening in that way. But if you think about that versus something like the actual Cold War standoff stuff between North and South Korea, and what happens in those scenarios, they're staring at each other with binoculars across a minefield. You know, it's just like out the window, like looking at each other with the binoculars from across a field, standing there looking at each other like this. And then the DPRK then purposefully they only choose the tallest fellas, because of course everyone's malnourished because they're getting starved to death and they're eating dead bodies and eating rats and everything, eating dead people over in North Korea. So they're only having to just picking the tallest fellas they can find. So like anyone over 5'2" or whatever has to join the army, because then they want tall fellas to make themselves look hard on the border with South Korea.
It's fucking bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Kieran, you said there was 2 Russian guys that basically we'll never know about. Do you have any more information on those and what happened in that situation?
100%. So I go on to talk about the 2 of them here, and I'll read one story at a time. We can have a chat about how fucking mad these situations were. So the first of these heroes to whom we are indebted for our existence was named Vasili Arkhipov. Details of the shockingly lucky event only emerged in 2002 with the declassification of certain Soviet documents. On October 27, 1962, during the high tensions of the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis, Arkhipov was on a submarine which had been located by the US Navy off the coast of Cuba. What the US Navy did not know, as they dropped non-lethal charges down onto the submarine to encourage it to surface, however, was that it was armed with a nuclear torpedo, which they had permission to fire without seeking approval from Moscow. Furthermore, the submarine was not only running out of electricity and oxygen, but also had no radio communication for days. And with tensions so high, the possibility that World War III may have already started was very real for the sweltering hot crew members, many of whom were passing out from the 45 degrees Celsius heat and carbon dioxide poisoning. So real, in fact, that the submarine captain was quoted from Soviet intelligence reports as saying, quote, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy," close quote. If that nuclear device was fired, the likelihood of catastrophic retaliation by the US was extremely high. This single mushroom-shaped cloud off the coast of the US may have been the spark that burned the world down. The likelihood of this having been the first domino to fall on the end of humanity was captured clearly in the following quote by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., a former Kennedy aide and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. Quote, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history," close quote. Arkhipov, as the commander of the flotilla and the third person needed in order to fire, was able to veto the desire to launch by the other 2 senior officers on board. Somehow, possibly due to having been in an accident involving radiation poisoning and the death of many of his crew on a sub the previous year, he was able to maintain a cool head and recognize that the charges were being dropped to send a signal and not in an attempt to damage their submarine. He had noticed that there seemed to be a pattern to the explosions that made him think that the Americans were signaling rather than attacking. He managed to convince the others of this, and they surfaced peacefully before returning to Russia. For his actions in those moments, the now deceased Arkhipov received the 2017 Future of Life Award, which was gifted to his family in his stead. Future of Life president and MIT professor of physics Max Tegmark said of Arkhipov, quote, Vasili Arkhipov is arguably the most important person in modern history, thanks to whom on October 27, 2017, isn't the 55th anniversary of World War III. Quote, close quote. Tegmark also said, quote, he has, in my opinion, made the greatest positive contribution to humanity of any human in modern history, close quote. Arkhipov received the first ever Future of Life Award for his decisions that day, which, quote, seeks to recognize and reward those who take exceptional measures to safeguard the collective future of humanity, close quote. The following year, in 2018, a fellow Soviet comrade of his was given the second of these awards. That's some fucking story, isn't it?
Yeah, this is unbelievable. And just as way of context, before, I know we spoke in the last podcast about Hiroshima being obviously the Pacific theater of the war. For people who are not very familiar about World War II, there was basically the European theater of war, if you want to call it that. The Russians at the time were allies of the Americans and the British, right, against, Hitler. So whichever side you think is good or bad, you decide. But they're all on the one side at the one time. And there's pictures you can see of Stalin and I think Roosevelt and Churchill all sitting around like shaking hands like all friends, even though they all were a bit wary of one another. But after World War II, that's really what happened, because the Russians came down on one side of Europe and the Allies came in on the other side, if you want to call them the Americans and the British. And that's how the Berlin Wall was established, or East versus West Germany. So the minute the war stopped, a new war began straight away called the Cold War, which basically was this divide between capitalist West and sort of Russian communist East. However, Cuba, basically an island, I think only, I can't remember how far it is from Florida, but basically only like less than 100 miles, I think, from Florida Keys. You have this island, Cuba, where Che Guevara and Fidel Castro liberated. I was there actually in 2010 for a holiday. It's quite an interesting place. Talk about propaganda. Another episode, another day, I think, as well, that one. I can share some insights from that.
Liberate is an interesting used way to describe what Che Guevara and Castro got up to.
Yeah, well, I use the word loosely. I've read a lot about Che Guevara, and I like Che Guevara and I don't like Che Guevara. But anyway, there's elements I like and elements I don't. A very polarizing character. But I think in just terms of setting that up to what's happening with this missile crisis is really important, because that's why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962. And prior to that, we also had another war, the Korean War, which actually separated North Korea and Korea in South, that you spoke about, Karen, which happened in around 1952, I think it was. 1950 to 1953, where America was involved in that, Australia was involved in that, and basically it was South versus North Korea, a communist war. And this guy here that you're talking about, I'm just going to share screen here again, and I'll put this link into the show notes, because, like you said, Karen, I think we have it's worth noting this man for a moment, because we have a lot to offer to him here, or a lot to be thankful to him for. And that's exactly just what you outlined. There's a picture of that man there, and it's this is the Future of Life Studies. I've put this up here, and I got some great pictures here in this little short clip, and just basically summarizing that story that you said as well. So
yeah, that's a phenomenal. They have a great podcast as well, The Future of Life.
Yeah,
Institute podcast is very good. It's all about existential risk and artificial intelligence, all the different factors affecting the potential threats to the future of humanity. It's a really good website as well. They've got a link. They have a whole page on nuclear near misses as well.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So there's his daughter and his grandson taking the award in 2017, 55 years afterwards. Cool. Man, isn't it crazy, like, in some ways, how there's these kind of seminal moments, or these what I would call forks in the road, and we've all probably had them in our life where we make decisions, or we go left when we should have gone right, or something like this happens. And
pause that there for a second. Pause the video. For any of the audio, if you pause that for a sec, I want to read that quote. So this is from the daughter of Vasili Arkhipov. Her name is Alina. And she said, my father always thought that he did what he had to do and never considered his actions as heroism. He did his part for the future so that everyone can live on our planet. You know, like, that's actually legitimately what happened. Like, think about the scale, like in that Cuban Missile Crisis, at this peak tension between the US and Russia during that 12, 13 day period. If a mushroom cloud had appeared off the coast, that close to the coast of America during those kind of tensions, like, what kind of a domino effect could that have kicked off, like, during those kind of, and this is before people understood the concept of nuclear winters, before people understood the reality of climate change as a result of firestorms putting particulate matter into the air. It was just thought about maybe nuclear fallout could happen, you know, and the destruction initially, but then also the nuclear fallout. And the reality that it was just one man's decision that was able to keep a cool, calm head during a scenario in which there was people passing out around him from carbon dioxide poisoning and from heat exhaustion. The air system was falling apart. There had no radio communications. World War III could very well have already kicked off, and they wouldn't have known about it down under the ocean like that. And then during this time where the war could have already kicked off, it's peak tensions, radio communications are down, it's sweltering heat, people are passing out. And this lad, Vasili Arkhipov, was able to keep a cool and calm enough head to be able to veto the other two lads. And what I didn't mention in that section of the essay, that there was 3 other boats in the subs in the flotilla. And out of those, but luckily, Arkhipov was on the one that was found, and the Americans didn't know about the other 3. So if Arkhipov had been on one of the other 3 boats and not on that one, because he was the admiral of the flotilla, he wouldn't have been on it. And the other 2 lads, there was 3 lads, there was 2 lads on each of the other boats that if they decided to fire, they were allowed to fire. Like I said about, they didn't need permission from Moscow. And there was a Communist Party representative and there was the captain of the sub. If both of those lads agreed, then they were allowed to fire the nuke. But Arkhipov, thankfully, was on the only sub that was found out of the flotilla. And he was able to override and veto the other 2 lads. But if he had been on the other boats and not this one, this boat didn't have radio communications. So he wouldn't have been able to override them. And he wouldn't, even if he could, he wouldn't have been in the sub. So he wouldn't have recognized that there was a pattern to the practice depth charges that were like left, right, like in a kind of a metronomic pattern that allowed him to think this isn't an attack. So think about how mad that is. Underwater in a 45 degrees Celsius tube of steel. People are passing out from poisoning gas. Air conditioning is failing, communications are down, peak crisis, can't communicate with anyone else, and explosions are going off above your head, and you're in this metal tube under the ocean. And these two other lads are losing their fucking mind, wanting to take the fucking US Navy down with them because they don't want to fail Mother Russia. And this captain is losing his shit talking about we're going to take them down with us and we're going to die, but we're not going to disgrace our Navy. And this fella is able to stay cool and calm enough to decide, you know what, lads, we're not pushing the button. There's a pattern to this. It's not worth it. Let's surface and see what's up. That's what happened. And that's why this human race is still around. It's like the enormity of the story is I didn't even do it justice there. Like, it's so hard to talk. It's so hard to give it justice, like to do it justice. And we don't know about these characters because of maybe a legacy from the Cold War, where even though this stuff came out in 2002 with unclassified documents from the Soviet Union, there's still a kind of a ripple. And maybe it's because of tensions still to this day between Russia and the West and these big power games and all this kind of stuff, where Western powers, it's not in their interest to highlight heroic Russian deeds because they don't want to make any of them look like heroes or make it look like they want. The narrative is that the West, the free West prevailed, and there's a certain truth that, of course, the free West prevailed. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Yeah, this
Reagan.
kind of shit.
Yeah.
Reagan, sorry, yeah. Reagan saying that to Gorbachev and all this stuff, and there's like this big, and it is very well the case that the free world did prevail, thankfully, in Russia, even it's not as bad as it was, even though it's like the political situation over there is a different discussion, but it's supposedly a democracy. But the situation obviously is complex, but it's still not. Thankfully, people still are able to leave the country and travel around, and it's not gulags anymore like that, So, like the enormity of that story is it's been. I can't help but think it's been overshadowed by an unwillingness to acknowledge non-Western heroes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. This is a great story. It makes me think of like free will, no free will. Again, I think that Sam Harris talks about these perfect circumstances that aligned. Was there some sort of, I don't know, entity, angel placing this man here at this time? Was it just pure circumstance and pure luck? And then you're talking about, the whole kind of thing that we're talking about, the cultural movement that was not a cultural movement, the cultural scenarios at the time. Like for anybody that, I'm probably the younger of the people that would remember that. There's older people that remember far more than I would. But I remember, I don't know, did you ever hear this song by Sting called Russians? Have you ever heard that song?
No.
It's a great song. I'll put the link in the show notes so you can read it. It was released in 1985. I remember this when I was a kid. Being out, and the lyrics are, in Europe and America, there's a growing feeling of hysteria, conditioned to respond to all the threats in the rhetorical speeches of the Soviets. Mr. Grushkov says, we will bury you. I don't subscribe to this point of view. It's such an ignorant thing to do if the Russians love their children too. How can I save my little boy from Oppenheimer's deadly toy? There is no monopoly on common sense on either side of the political fence. We share the same biology, regardless of ideology. Believe me when I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too. I know people love me singing on the podcast, so I thought I'd sing that. Yeah. But that's a great
lyrics.
Yeah, great lyrics. And it goes on. There's more to it as well. There is no historical precedent to put the words in the mouth of the president. There's no such thing as a winnable war. It's a lie we don't believe anymore. Mr. Reagan says we will protect you. I don't subscribe to this point of view. Believe me when I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too. It's a great song. I don't think people really know this song that well. It was like I said, it was released in 1985. So I was about 7 at the time when it came out, but it was out for a couple of years. But it's on. Interesting enough, Karen, there's a best of Sting and the Police. And this song is on some versions and not on others. In a best of album. Yeah. Anyway.
I like those lyrics, man. I can't help but think as well. Like, we were talking about earlier on around why we hate each other and do war, etc. And it's like, well, it's this tendency that we have to feel special. Like, I'm not saying that there's an equality between ideologies. Like, my ideology is much more tilted towards human freedom of expression. I see things like communism and Marxism as arrogant, just as I'd see religious dogma as arrogance. Yeah. These arrogant expressions, these arrogant claims of certainty around a particular, this religion is the truth about the creation of the universe or whatever. That to me is just, this is the last person that God sent, or this is whatever. And this definitely happened in a historical event. And I just see that stuff as arrogance, the same way that these big claims, like for me, what's important is not how do we figure out the best way of doing things with the best ideology and the best. What's important is how do we correct errors before we do too much harm. And that's why something like democracy works, like a democratic free society works, not because, and it's the best, not because, and free speech and freedom of expression, that stuff works, not because, and it's same with market forces in a very similar way as well. Like, capitalism has dark sides, of course, but the reason it's better than communism is because it allows for the correction of errors before too much harm is done.
Like science.
It's like science. That's what it works. And it basically, the basic components of how these things work, like in terms of freedom of expression and a respect for reason and evidence, in conjunction with something like the ability to remove political leaders using ballot paper so that we don't have to shed blood to do so. the reason that those things are useful is just like science, that we can correct errors before we go too astray. And so that's where I'm tilted toward, is what's important is error correction. And that's why communism is a farce, because they can't correct errors, because it's a dictatorship. That's why economically it's a farce, because there aren't market forces to correct errors, and you'd have factories that need to make a certain amount of shoes, so they're going to take the easiest route possible and make 11,000 left boots size 11, because that's the easiest way for them to hit their quotas. You know, because they know that no one's going to buy the fucking shoe, so there's no incentives.
There's no incentive, yeah. And then even the people working in that factory are like, well, what's the point working here to work harder to get more money, because there's no incentive. I say get the same pay. And then other people like, what's the point in being a medical doctor or spending 9 years at uni to do something when I can just go on the road and fucking turn hay over and get the same amount of money anyway? So what's the fucking point?
There's no error correction. There's no contact with reality. They're too removed from the basics of biology, which is evolution by selection pressure. So like basically that's how science works. That's how markets work. That's how when there's actually a functioning open society with freedom, with free press and a democracy, that's how politicians get elected versus not, is that we get given information accurately about politicians that then allows us to be able to make decisions. That's theoretically how it should work.
And there's the key, Kieran, is about the freedom of information and the freedom of the press. And I think at the moment, in certain contexts, that's not happening. However, here's an interesting one on this. So in today's world, whilst I'm worried about government control and I'm worried about, leaders being elevated to these lofty stances, around medical issues and so on, it worries me a lot. In saying that, I was watching a history documentary the other day, which is very, very interesting. If anybody's in Australia or you have access to a VPN, this is worth watching. It's Australia in color, right? And so what I've done is I've gone right back to like 1900, where they've got all black and white sort of video, and they've recolorized it and they've, pimped it up, so to speak, and they tell a bit of story with it. And Hugo Weaving, the actor that was in The Matrix, is the narrator of it. And it's done really well. Like, they don't kind of labor on a point like a history documentary for 20 minutes, or don't have academics talk. They're just nice and easy, and it's really nice to watch. I'm on episode 3 or 4 at the moment. I can't remember how many there is. It might be 4. It's on SBS here in Australia. It's a channel. So if you go to sbs.com.au, you can watch it Australian colour. And interesting in that, Kieran, they were talking about World War II, and they were talking about what went on here. So Australia was a really xenophobic country. Didn't want any people of colour or anything different. They had a white Australia policy, right? And they didn't want anybody in here. And in the 50s, right, people came in. But during the war, if you were German or Italian or Asian looking, even if you weren't like Japanese, they took you out of the community and put you in a concentration camp, more or less, or not concentration camp, right, the wrong word, sorry. I'll take that back. An internment camp here in Australia, because you came from one of those countries. They were like, well, we can't have that going on because you might be passing secrets, right? Even though you might have lived in Australia for 20 years. So they put you in these camps. And then the other thing they did, Kieran, as well, and I saw footage of this, they censored all the mail coming into the country. And I was like, oh, wait now. I was like, I shook my head. This fucking shit's been going on the whole time. And then they were also doing propaganda messages about, bringing British people in to populate Australia. You had this program called Bring in a Brit. So to bring a white person into Australia, and had like people in the yard. Oh, like in an English accent. Oh, we've come here from Manchester 4 years ago and we love it here in Australia. Go on out, we're bringing out a Brit. Do your part for Australia. And you're like going, what the fuck? Like, so this propaganda and censorship has always existed in some shape, way, or form. And we've isolated people.
But that's where, and actually America did the same thing during World War II with Japanese people. Yeah. They took Japanese people out of the community and put them into camps in case they were spies, or in case they were going to do bad stuff for and they ended up, I'm not sure how that ended up resolving, whether what kind of apologies were made or what.
I don't think there was, Kieran. I had a guy on my podcast called Kendall Yamamoto. Kendall is a Canadian Japanese guy. And we sort of spoke about in the start of one of my episodes, if people want to go and listen to it. Kendall's a very high level golf coach. He's coached like Vijay Singh. He's like that level of golf coach. And we spoke about it a little bit, but I think Kendall got a bit uncomfortable. So I didn't want to ask too many questions. And Kendall's a nice guy and a friend of mine. We've hung out together in Vancouver. But he was talking about, because his family members were put into those camps in Canada and America. And so I don't think there was much said of it. I think it was kind of just brushed under the carpet, mate, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'm actually deadly curious. I don't know how that resolved. I just know about the camp, but I don't know if there was any actual truth and reconciliation kind of committee set up to figure out, okay, look, do we need to apologize? Like, how do we going to apologize? Not do we need to, but
I'm
like,
not sure. And the other thing on that as well, I got a friend who's a masseuse here, and he's from Argentina, but he's actually Japanese originally. Well, let me rephrase that. He's Japanese, but he was born in Argentina, but his grandparents came to Argentina after World War II.
Mm.
And so his family, he said, like in Argentina, for example, for him, lots of like difficulty integrating, even though he's like third generation, you know, and even though he speaks fluent Spanish, like he speaks Spanish, Japanese, and English. And he's got a master's degree in osteopath, as an osteopath, and he can't get work here as an osteopath because his qualifications aren't recognized. So he's working as a masseuse, which is a fucking shame. But, you know, he was talking about that as well, sort of post-war. He's about my age, and he was talking about like post-war type of stuff, and even into the 80s and 90s in Argentina, we're trying to integrate. There's this kind of, we kind of came here from that. Yeah. So it's interesting, like how this kind of knocks on for many years, because it's not that long ago, really, when you sit and think about it. Like 70 years ago, man, this happened. This is nothing. Like,
no, it's so recently. That's the bizarre thing about it. And so so a lot of the team that we have, and since even the start of this discussion today, and even before we were recording off mic, is like this capacity that humans have to project outwards onto a scapegoat and to dehumanize the outgroup. That's like one of the darkest components of the human condition, is to see people as part of a group and not as unique individuals, but to see them through some means of identification as the enemy, the unpure, the unclean, the untrustworthy, to demonize, denigrate, dehumanize, and eventually destroy when you take it to its logical conclusions, which happens at basically anytime there's been a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. That's the pathway it takes. It's like mild denigration into dehumanization, into demonization. Eventually, once you can literally demonize them, past dehumanization and denigration, then that's when you have gulags, concentration camps, gas chambers, machete squads, whatever, to pick your modality of ethnic cleansing. And that's essentially the pathway it takes. And that's why we should always be wary of any time, in any context, where it becomes possible to dehumanize an outgroup and to see a human as anything other than a unique individual that's also just struggling to figure shit out and get by and have their own difficulties in life. And they too are going to die, and they too are going to have loved ones that are going to die, and they're going to get illnesses just like us, and they're going to they're going to have setbacks and ups and downs just like us. They have their own hopes and dreams just like us. They may very well have ideologies that conflict with a free and open society, but they're still just individuals that are trying to figure shit out and grab whatever bit of ideology is floating by to keep their head above the water. You know, that's the best they've been able to do. And as soon as for anything, that's something that should be just alarm bells, you know. And like and this thing, this current discussion, we won't go down this rabbit hole now, because I want to read the second story before we finish up. But I just want to point out that this, for whatever someone's view around the vaccine, this idea of dehumanizing and denigrating people in any way who are hesitant around it is unbelievably toxic, and should be ringing alarm bells in anyone who has any sniff of historical precedence around what happens once you start scapegoating people and projecting fears and insecurities onto people as if they are this unpure, unclean thing. And so it's that seems to be a kind of a running theme in what we were discussing even off mic today.
Another thing, Karen, I just want to say, and this is a question. I'm gonna put this as an open question, and we'll probably come back. I don't want to disrupt your second part of your second story there before we finish today, but I do want to ask you this question, and I'm not looking for the answer today, but this may be something we can discuss. Or if anybody has got any ideas from the listeners, I would love to hear this. You talked about a group being denigrated or vilified, or, you know, genocide, or whatever word you want to use, or being marginalized. Over time in history of the world, that's happened to groups. And some have been resilient and some have not been. For example, today in China, the Uyghur group, Muslim people, Chinese Muslim people, are being systematically kind of hit, if you want to call it that. People, Qigong practitioners, we've spoken about before, harvested for their organs. Falun Gong, Qigong practitioners. If you think about what's happened in places like America, the native Indian people there, the First Nation peoples of America, systematically eradicated out through disease and whatever else. Same with Aboriginal people here in Australia. Then you have other places like where that was attempted but didn't happen. So, for example, and this is blowing our own trumpet here, Irish people. Lloyd George famously said in the 1920s, Ireland has been the thorn in the side of the British Empire since we went there. And I love that statement because that's like a complete fuck you to the British Empire. Not that I hate British people, by the way, but it's like for 800 years, similar things were tried to be done to the Irish. They took away our language, cultures, took away lots of things that we did from our Celtic culture. And I'm not saying it's worse than what happened in other places. They sent nearly 250,000 people to the Caribbean to work in indentured servitude for a period of 5 years before granted their freedom. They sent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to Australia. People were just snatched off the street for doing something and then put in Kilmainham jail, held in Kilmainham jail until they were able to board a ship and sent to Australia. People were convicted then of crimes, not just general convicts, and put out here, but you had kids as young as 11 and 12 just getting sent here to Australia for no reason. Then you had all the bullshit that was on in Ireland for years and years, and to a certain degree still goes on in Northern Ireland. But Irish people seem to be resilient to that. And I'm just wondering why one culture will fall underneath that and other cultures will thrive and come up over. Why is some, and I know every case is different and every culture is different. And to some degree, it's like even, post kind of communism, Russia's been thriving, if you want to call it that, in terms of economically, but Cuba still hasn't really kind of got out of that. It's kind of an open question about when some cultures are oppressed, why do some resist and do okay and others just basically crumble down so easily?
I think there's so many different factors there. And one thing that's worth pointing out is that like humans are capable both. And there's a guy, Daniel Schmachtenberger, has made this point really eloquently in numerous interviews, where humans are capable both of being Jainists that won't hurt bugs. And we're also capable of being child soldiers in parts of Africa that won't make it to adulthood unless they've butchered someone to death and killed people.
Yeah.
So we're capable of being both of those things. So imagine if you have so just because, and the thing, this is the kind of I suppose it's kind of like a commentary on the kind of populace that can survive, in that in North America, for example, the tribes that managed to survive the longest in terms of the combat with the Europeans that came over were the roaming militaristic tribes, whereas the peaceful, more communitarian, agricultural tribes that were much more peaceful, less interested in violence, less interested in raids and combat, they were the first to be wiped out. So because they didn't have the weapons, they didn't have the organization, didn't have the skills in combat, they didn't have the capacity to uproot and move when the threat came. So like there's something about as well, and I'm not saying that being a farmer is going to get you killed, because obviously there was loads of farming in Ireland, but there's the kind of things that allow a populace to survive oppression aren't necessarily the kind of things that actually make for the kind of society we'd like to live in as well. Because what allows survival in certain respects are the desire to fight, the willingness to fight, the willingness to be able to kill and destroy and denigrate the opposition, the capacity to form our own in-group and project outwards. Whereas if you have a tribe of people that are actually enlightened, like imagine you have a load of people that are like Thich Quang Duc, the burning monk, living in a tribe, and they're all totally, they have this kind of like enlightened loss of sense of self. They have a total sense of outward compassion and unification with nature around them and other people. they may very well be unwilling to take up arms and just like, okay, kill me if you want, man. You know, like Obi-Wan Kenobi just put the sword down and take the slash of the sword off Darth Vader. And it's like, I've thought a good bit about this, man, this question. And with Ireland, it would be so complex to go into. And I think there'll be loads of areas you need to touch on, like the sense of unification that came with, I think, let's say, for example, being unified under the Catholic flag, you know, for example.
Yeah.
And having this sense of unification, and there's other elements there. And the fact that Ireland is so parochial and localized and isolated communities, and having a language that was people were able to, there's so many different factors. But I suppose what I was just trying to point to is that the type of society that is most resilient to oppression isn't the kind of society that we'd actually, in the long haul, kind of want to be orientating toward modeling ourselves after, like, because they're actually because then you just get overrun by the kind of society that's willing to be a barbarian.
Yeah.
You know, but then it's the fascinating paradox is that, and this is even in the Bible, this kind of paradox is even talked about by Jesus, where like in one part of the Bible, Jesus will say, love thy enemy. And then another part of the Bible, he'll say, I bring not peace, but a sword.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like, there's a reality there. And that paradox of what it means to perpetuate life, it's like reflected also in Star Wars, where in the same movie series, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi is doing well in his fight against Darth Vader. And then when he realizes the Millennium Falcon is about to get away, he decides that he's actually, his role is actually to be killed.
Yeah. That's his purpose. Yeah. His dharma as the Buddhists would say.
Yeah. So then he puts his sword away and he gets killed. But then you have Luke fight all the way through to the end. And then eventually in the new Star Wars movies, Luke gets killed, you know? So it's like, that's a kind of it's an element of the hero's journey. Sometimes it's your role. Yeah. Or let's say even in the concentration camps of the Jews, there was people there whose their role that they played. And I'm not saying that there's some kind of cosmic intervention, but there was people in those camps that Frankl wrote about, where their role that they played was that of being the person who shared the last bit of food and starved to death. And there was other people there who were capos, who at the other end of the extreme were helping the Nazi guards to run the camp in exchange for food. Yeah. So you had both of those extremes playing out. And then at the other side, you had people who were able to maintain somewhere in the middle. You had a people who were able to play enough of a game to not starve to death, but then not be a capo, but be able to help the morale of people in a way that was, they maybe had to do some dodgy stuff to be able to just survive. But then but they had a bigger, like someone like Frankl wrote about in the camps, like all the good people died.
Yeah.
But the best people died because they all starved because they shared. But then you had the worst people were the ones who just were all about survival and nothing else. And they fucked over everyone else. But then along that, you had a spectrum of people who weren't as selfless, but who were still able to do good things. And it's like to try and bottle up the human condition. Because if everyone behaved like the capo, then it's everyone against everyone else. And people are just scrambling to fuck everyone else over. But if everyone behaved, and then no one survives, because you end up where it's like too many crabs trying to pull every other crab back from the top of the bucket. And similarly, if everyone behaves like the totally selfless individual, then everyone just starves to death because everyone's trying to give their food to someone else and everyone dies. So it's like the spectrum of behavior that plays out. And if you can map that concentration camp example out onto a populace, out onto types of populace, you know, like a group of Jainists in a village, and some barbarians rock up to the village, they're just all going to be wiped out because they're unwilling to fight back. Or a group, because they're all like, their idea of the world is not to harm. you know? Whereas, so I don't know if I've never actually tried to explain this out loud before.
I think that's great, because I don't think there is an answer, but what you've done is, I think you've actually, and I'm going to think about this a little bit more, because you've highlighted a number of factors or a number of, we'll say, things that I didn't consider. Like, for example, I often see Aboriginal people here in Australia being, numbers of Aboriginal people declining, culture being lost. There's obviously a very sad story that happened here with Aboriginal people in Australia. Loss of culture. They had the stolen generation where kids were taken away. And again, that documentary I spoke about earlier on, Australian Colour, it talks about some of these things. Aboriginal people were infected with smallpox for them to die. They weren't recognized as citizens of the country.
Or even
people are under the Flora and Fauna Act. Like, it's just crazy, right? And you see all that and you think to yourself, how did this group of people decline over time? But other groups like that, like what happened to people in Ireland, I'm not saying it was the exact same thing, but that nearly drove us together, right? In terms of like Irish people, right? And so I think what the difference is, like you were saying, is like they had the Catholic flag, there was like a unity, where in Australia, Aboriginal people were dispersed, so to speak. They were in different mobs, right? Different groups. So there wasn't an overarching body, geographically dispersed. So it's easy to kind of probably break down a society, if you want to call it that, that's here when they're geographically dispersed and not technologically advanced. We at the time, I suppose, were getting education from the British. We were very localized. We were very much within that empire. So we were like the Star Wars. We were like fighting from the inside out there, like in Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there was also fuck all agriculture in Australia, I'd imagine, which played a factor. Because if you look at, like, it would have been in the interests as well in the ownership of Ireland by the Brits to develop relationships and to keep Irish people around to farm the land.
Yeah, because we were like a breadbasket for England, really.
Yeah. Whereas there wasn't, I think the only agriculturally producible product in Australia up to when the Europeans arrived was basically macadamia nuts or something, isn't it? Like, and you can't grow a civilization off macadamia nuts, like, Yeah,
I'm not sure, unless you have a lot of EpiPens, because people are allergic to nuts.
Yeah. So I think there's all different factors where it's like, where are the interests? Where do the interests lie here in terms of, even amongst the rulers, what is in their interest to do? And with the Aborigines, because there wasn't as much farmable land or agricultural, it became easier to just brush them aside because they weren't as useful to the people who were. Whereas in Ireland, we would have been, as well as the other unifying factors like the parochial nature, the links to the Catholic Church, having this unifying bond. These kind of things would have meant that there was that, but there was also a utility that Irish people would have served to the people who were ruling the place as well, in terms of producing food.
All right, mate. We might have to put a line under this one. Is it possible that we could bookmark your second story and continue on our next recording session with because I'm fascinated. Well, I know we went on a lot of tangents there today, but I'm fascinated to keep this thread of this nuclear war, although we didn't probably speak a lot about nuclear war. But is it possible to bookmark that and continue next week?
100%, man.
All right. I'll pause it there. We'll be back, guys. We'll be back. Don't worry. We're all going to die.